the small group as a system. Objectives: list and explain the major input, throughput, and output variables in a small group system and provide examples of their interdependence. Define the main terms and types of variables pertaining to systems. Explain how these variables can be evaluated for effectiveness. Describe the main concepts of the bona fide group perspective. Throughout this lecture, please do take note that all components of a small group operate interdependently with one another, and the group itself is interdependent with its environment. To understand a group fully, we must examine the components in relationship to one another and not in isolation. To clearly explain our topic, during one traumatic week, the church board, one minister, and 3 lay people of a new church faced nearly insurmountable challenges. On Monday, the board chair suffered a stroke. On Wednesday, the minister died. The remaining members, in shock, recruited 3 other members to help carry on the work. The board had been working to establish a second church of that diocese in Imus, following an unpleasant church split 2 years earlier. The new church has just gotten off the ground when these tragedies occurred. But the members committed to their project decided to keep the church going. The board elected Jose, a lawyer, as chairperson. Maria, a widow whose husband had been a minister, agreed to serve as secretary. The other members include Marina, a college professor, Teresita, director of a university speech and hearing clinic, and Ernesto, a massage therapist who was also an accomplished musician. No paid employees worked for the church. All the work was accomplished by volunteers, including the board members. Among the challenges board members faced were how to handle Sunday services without a minister, how to pay for the lease they had recently signed on an older building, and how to overcome opposition of the new congregation from the diocese headquarters and the original church's minister. The board quickly decided they needed additional expertise, so they soon added 2 more members, Eduardo, a retired business owner, and Antonio, a maintenance worker. The members had diverse experiences and expertise, but they all shared a similar vision for the church and common values to guide them in their work. The board met every week for 2 years. At the end of that time, members could point to several important accomplishments. Sunday services were held every week, and attendance had increased from about 40 members to about 90 members per Sunday. Bylaws had been approved by the congregation. The board, originally an informal, self-selected board, was voted in by the congregation. Enough money had been set aside to cover a minister's salary for 6 months. And most important of all, the formerly renegade congregation had received official approval from the diocese headquarters and was now legal. You see, small groups are pervasive in our daily lives, and this is why we should study them. In this lecture, we will use the church board we just introduced to illustrate the basic principles of general system theory, a framework for understanding small groups. We periodically present dialogue from the church board to illustrate how various principles of system theory may appear communicatively. Once you have a communication-based model for understanding system principles, you can recognize the principles operating in any group. The system's perspective. When a new person joins a group, the group changes in some ways. For example, when a new baby is brought into a family, all family relationships will change, including between the parents, among the other children, and among the parents and the children. In addition, new relationships must be accommodated between everyone else and the new baby. This illustrates the idea of a system, a set of relationships among interdependent interacting components and forces. A system is also an entity made up of components, interdependent relationship to each other, requiring constant adaptation among its parts to maintain organic wholeness and balance. General systems theory is built upon an analysis of living entities, including groups and organizations, as they attempt to remain in dynamic balance with the environment by making constant adjustments. The systems framework helps you keep track of all individual components of a small group as they interact in a complex whole. The group system metaphor has long been dominant among small groups communication scholars because, in part, its key premise is that communication links the relevant parts of a system together. We like the approach because it brings the role of the communication to the forefront of what we study, and it helps the students manage the complexity of small group communication. Even when we focus on small part of the puzzle, the systems framework reminds us that each piece of the puzzle interacts with every other piece. However, the system's perspective has been criticized by some scholars. For instance, some have questioned how useful this perspective is because it appears to be a philosophical framework rather than a useful explanatory framework. Others have said that the system's approach focuses too much on groups' dynamic balance or homeostasis. In other words, systems theories assume that a system's goal is to maintain stability. Thus, the system framework calls more attention to how groups stay the same rather than how they change. Our point here is not to elaborate on or refute these specific concerns, but to let you know that this is one of the several theories used to understand small group communication. We now begin the process of examining how communication helps shape the small group as a system. Principles of a system. I'm going to discuss 5 different principles: the interdependence, non-summativity, equifinality, multifinality, and multiple causation. Let's look at them one by one. Interdependence, or the central system principle. It states that the parts of a system do not operate in isolation but continuously affect each other, as well as the system as a whole. Remember the new baby I am talking about earlier? Well, the new baby affects every other family member. Similarly, if the useful, cheerful chairperson of a committee comes to a group meeting in a grouchy mood, the other members may feel uneasy and the group's normally effective decision-making processes may be impaired. In the church board we described earlier, every decision was accomplished through open discussion that emphasized member interdependence. For example, for a Sunday service to proceed without a hitch, the worship coordinator had to book the speaker and print the programs. The decorator had to make sure that the flowers were in place and the hymnals are distributed. And the hospitality coordinator had to unlock the building and make the coffee. If anyone failed to do his or her job, the service as a whole would be hurt. To simply put it, competent group members understands that this interrelatedness among all components of a group, including group members, compels group members to be accountable to each other as they work together, not separately toward their goal. The consequences of their choices during the process of group deliberation reverberate throughout the entire group system. George Will, a Newsweek columnist, dramatically illustrates the principle of interdependence and also reminds us that because we are all interdependent, actions we take sometimes have unanticipated consequences. You see, when Lincoln Memorial was illuminated at night, the lights attracted insects, which attracted the spiders that fed on them, which then attracted the birds that fed on the spiders. To keep the monument beautiful for visitors, workers scrubbed the bird droppings and the spider webs that accumulated, but the act of scrubbing the marble made it susceptible to the exhaust fumes from the traffic in Washington, D.C. Lighting the monument intended to have a positive effect. Also, set in motion a chain of events that is contributing to the monument's deterioration. We cannot know in advance all the effects of our actions will cause. Another key principle is the system property of non-summativity, or also called non-additivity, which states that the whole system is not just the sum of its parts. It may be either greater or less than the sum of its parts. with either positive synergy or negative synergy operating. Sports fans know that they will lose money on a basketball or football game if they add up the statistics for each player, arrive at the team totals, and bet on the team with the higher total. On any given day, a so called poor team can play beyond its apparent potential, or a terrific team can have an off day. Well, why? Because each team or group is a living system, and it means everything is interdependent, and no one can predict precisely how the new system will function during any particular time or how the parts will affect one another. A team takes on a life of its own and becomes a real living entity that is based on members' abilities, but is not simply a totaling up of their skills. For example, the then Southwest Missouri State University Lady Bears basketball team, whose players were shorter, slower, and less experienced than many top tier women team, won the National Invitational Tournament in 2005. On the other hand, the knowledgeable, intelligent, and dedicated scientists and managers at NASA collectively made a flawed decision in 1986 to launch a space shuttle called Challenger, which exploded just after the liftoff. You see, no one can predict with certainty whether a group will experience positive or negative synergy. In our classes, we have often had groups composed of bright students whose final products disappointed us. Salazar has pointed that the amount of ambiguity a group faces and how it handles the ambiguity play a major role. Ambiguity determines the types of obstacles a group will encounter. Whether the obstacles are dealt with in a helpful or disruptive ways determines whether a process loss or gain will occur. Another factor is team learning. Team learning, or the extent to which members have learned how to play the game together. Salisbury and her associates found that through interaction with one another, members listen to others' perspectives, integrate these with their own views, and collectively learn. Teams whose members explore different perspectives and develop collective meaning performed better than the teams that did not. In any case, the communication behavior of the members is the principal determining factor for processes gains or losses. Then we go to the next one, the principle of equifinality. It means equal ends. It suggests that different systems can reach the same outcome even if they have different starting places. The related principle of multifinality states that systems starting out at the same place may reach different endpoints. Both principles refer to the same idea. It is impossible to predict whether a system will end up by knowing only where it starts. So, going back to the church, odds were against the church board's success, right? A splinter group from the same original congregation had tried to start a new church years before and it had failed. But this church board, composed of ordinary yet dedicated individuals, succeeded. We have observed similar outcomes in many contexts, like the government, the community and voluntary organizations, business, and education. For example, one group of students turned in, at the last minute, a mediocre final paper because members had not been able to find a way to handle their interpersonal conflict. By the end of the semester, none of them ever wanted to see the others again. Early in the semester, though, we predicted that this group of individual A students would turn in an A paper. In the same class, another group of average students had gelled members, like each other wanted to do a good job and were willing to put an extra effort towards the task. They turned in a draft of the paper a week early so we could pre-grade it with comments. then took those comments and put the final finishing touches on what was an outstanding paper. They had a party to celebrate their success. As you can imagine, the communication among members is the key to where a group ends up. We can say that the system's perspective helps keeps us from oversimplifying our understanding of how a group functions and perhaps missing something important. For example, the system theory emphasizes multiple causation. So multiple causation means, by concept and definition, is the principle that each change in the system is caused by numerous factors. So, system theory emphasizes multiple causation. The fact that whatever happens in a system is not the result of a single simple cause, but it's produced by complex interrelationships among multiple forces. For example, several factors contributed to the church board's successful efforts, including the board's shared leadership. You remember Jose, the chairperson. Maybe his democratic coordination, or the commitment and expertise of all the members, the fact that the creation of our new congregation filled a need in the community, and probably some fortuitous factors such as the availability of an affordable location. That's it for the first part. Now, before we go to the second part, let me just have a quick recap or a quick review of what we discussed so far. So here, we're going to answer some comprehension questions and you're going to self-check your understanding of the lesson. Are you ready? Question number 1. Groups are living systems that operate under the following principles except 1. A. A system is a set of relationships among interdependent components. B. There are 2 advantages of the system's perspective for examining small groups. C. Groups as a system exhibit interdependence. Each component affects each other component. D. A small group system has only 7 functions. The correct answer is letter D. A small group system has only 7 functions. Question number 2. True or false? The groups and other systems are non-summative, as with sports teams, sometimes systems perform better than expected, positive synergy, and sometimes worse than negative synergy. Correct answer is true. Question number 3. Groups exhibit equifinality and multifinality means A. You cannot predict where a system ends from where it starts. B. It means the means will determine the end. C. The end justifies the means. Or letter D. None of the above. Correct answer is A. You cannot predict where a system ends from where it starts. Question number 4. What happens in a group or other systems that has multiple causes? A. You cannot predict where a system ends from where it starts. B. You cannot conclude the success of a goal by focusing only in one variable. C. You cannot point to one factor as being the one and only reason why something happens. D. None of the above. Correct answer? C. That's it for the first part. Thank you for listening. Now, here are my group mates for the rest of the report.